In the shadows of Omaha, Nebraska, there lurked monstrosities the world had yet to fathom. It was the quintessential Midwestern town, yet beneath the serenity, a malignant darkness festered. It was here that a vile scandal of systemic sexual abuse and satanic worship unfolded within the very institutions that were meant to protect the city from itself. In the mid-1980s, the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union served the most disenfranchised and underprivileged communities of Omaha. It operated under the guidance of Lawrence E. King Jr. He was a socialite, friends with those who were in positions of power, politicians and police who found themselves indebted to his favor. King sat on the boards of charitable organizations and seemed to give back to his community. But beneath this crafted exterior pulsed a darkness accused of some of the worst crimes imaginable. Investigators initiated an audit of the credit union, uncovering malicious and grotesque deceit. King was charged with 40 counts of embezzlement, fraud, and tax evasion, stealing over $39 million. Yet, the startling revelation of his financial crimes would only be the beginning. The investigation uncovered a horrifying narrative, stitched together by the testimonies of children. They named King as the architect of nightmares like ritualized abuse, cultist ceremonies, and a web of political blackmail that implicated figures like Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. They described a sinister underbelly of cruelty and corruption, the aftermath of which still echoes through the nation. The story of the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union begs a profoundly unsettling question. What if the very institutions meant to protect become the architecture of unimaginable horror? The Franklin Community Federal Credit Union was established in 1968 with the intention of making credit accessible to the African American community of North Omaha. It was a low-income credit union formed by community activists. It was a cornerstone of communal support, and it attracted deposits from charities, nonprofit organizations, and struggling individuals. The credit union offered certificates of deposit to non-members, and they provided financial services and education for residents, even helping when they couldn't cover their water or power bills. Lawrence E. King Jr. would become the manager in 1970, just 2 years after its establishment. Under his direction, the Franklin Credit Union expanded its services, like the initiative with the Consumer Service Organization, which managed welfare, disability, and Social Security checks. This expansion allowed a significant addition to the coffers of the Franklin Credit Union. King began offering high-interest certificates of deposit. They marked at 2 to 3% above market rates in an attempt to secure greater deposits at the credit union, and it was instrumental to the growth of the institution. However, it quickly became a Ponzi scheme where additional CDs were required to cover payments for maturing ones. These rates attracted investments and grants from corporate powerhouses and religious organizations, securing millions for the credit union. King leveraged these perceived successes to network with the movers and shakers of Omaha, and later, the national political arena. King started as a McGovern Democrat, but he changed his affiliation and became the chairperson of the National Black Republican Council. He was tasked with coordinating efforts to mobilize the black vote across 17 states, a role that placed him at the confluence of national politics and community outreach. King was a rising star of the GOP. He sang the Star-Spangled Banner at a Republican event in 1982 that was attended by President Reagan, and he sang the national anthem in 1988 at the RNC in New Orleans. Throughout the 80s, King became increasingly embedded in the Republican Party at the state and national level. His position with the Franklin Credit Union afforded him an annual salary of $16,000 a year, but King drove a $70,000 white Mercedes, chartered private jets and limousines, and rented multiple apartments and houses in Washington, D.C. and Omaha. He explained that his wealth came from old family money. The truth was much more sinister. King was exploiting his position at the credit union to fund his extravagant and debaucherous lifestyle. The Franklin Credit Union provided King with an inexhaustible bankroll. He expanded into multiple business ventures, owning restaurants and bars, including Omaha's Showcase Lounge, which was known to be frequented by pimps and sex workers. He began to donate heavily to Boys Town, a large orphanage in western Omaha started in 1917 as a shelter for young boys left behind with no family after World War I. In the 1990s, it was worth $500 million. The organization had expanded to owning its own school and church, where over 500 homeless and abandoned children were housed. Still, it was considered the richest square mile in the world. King also joined the board of directors for the Omaha Girls Club. He began to funnel vulnerable children from both organizations into his home, businesses, and parties under the guise of empowerment and employment. These children would allege realities far more horrifying than anyone could have anticipated. Before the shutdown of the Franklin Credit Union in November 1988, before the senatorial investigation and public unraveling, a complex web of disturbing rumors began to surface. These early whispers were first shared with law enforcement officers, social workers, and foster care administrators, hinting at a deeply entrenched network of sexual exploitation, abuse, and even satanic ritual, all implicating the city's most prominent figures. These initial reports were sporadic and often dismissed or downplayed by those in positions of authority, but as more victims came forward, the horrifying scope of these allegations could no longer be ignored. On June 10, 1985, a social worker with the Nebraska Department of Social Services received a call from the Sheriff's Department in Washington County. Records indicate the call was about child abuse complaints under the foster care of Jarrett and Barbara Webb. Jarrett was a board member of the Franklin Credit Union, and Barbara was Lawrence King's cousin. The call detailed 3 foster children who had significant bodily injuries. The children complained of abuse from their foster parents. They claimed that they had been beaten with a railroad iron and belt. The Webbs fostered 9 children, and more than half had run away from home in the past. During later investigations, DSS would remove several siblings from the home after reports from 6 of the children that they had been stripped nude and beaten for extended periods of time, and they had been denied meals. Unfortunately, the abuse didn't stop there. One victim, Lisa Webb, told Jane Tooley of the Sheriff's Department that she had been sexually abused since the age of 9. The Washington County prosecutor, Patrick Tripp, didn't believe Lisa's testimony. He required that she take 4 separate polygraph tests. She passed all 4 times, but Tripp attempted to discredit her, claiming that her story was too fantastical to be real. Tragically, this pattern of skepticism and disbelief would be a trend among investigators and prosecutors. Other children in the Webb home claimed to have found graphic images and videotapes, some portraying underage victims. They reported hearing that these materials had been produced and provided by Lawrence King. Julie Walters, a youth care worker at Boys Town, developed an extensive 51-page report based on interviews with Nellie and Kimberly Webb. She had extensive experience working with children who had suffered abuse, and she emphasized that the Webb children seemed truthful. Their narratives shared a remarkable level of detail, thematic consistency, and implicated figures, only enhancing their credibility. Nellie Webb reported that King would attend parties at the Omaha Girls Club, or he would throw parties at his home. King would call the Webbs and tell them to provide one or more children who would be forced to attend. She claimed the parties were attended by 30 adult patrons seeking the company of sex workers and children who were commingled. They would pay money, and the encounters would happen in communal areas, side rooms, or bedrooms. Horrifyingly, Nellie spoke about King flying her to Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C., where she met significant political players, including Vice President George Bush Sr. She described that these parties had countless bodyguards, admission key cards, and pat-down security, and behind closed doors, she saw powerful politicians engaged with young male sex workers. The Walters Report was given to the Department of Social Services in 1986, but there seemed to be little, if any, investigative interest. Barbara and Jarrett Webb lost their foster license, but they were not subject to any criminal charges for the abuses perpetrated. Separately, a 17-year-old girl and her mother filed a report with the Omaha Police Department after participating in an illicit photography session. The photographer, Rusty Nelson, approached the 17-year-old to be his subject for a European portfolio he was developing. The girl and her mother followed Nelson to his apartment for a 5-hour session where Nelson made inappropriate remarks and attempted to convince the girl to pose nude. The girl's mother noticed several nude photographs in the studio. Many of the subjects appeared to be minors. Officer Carmian interviewed the two women about the exploitation attempts of Rusty Nelson. They claimed that Nelson spoke of being self-employed, but regularly spoke of someone he called the boss. Investigators arrived at his apartment, and they found it had been vacated just 9 days after the initial report. The lease for Unit 3B in the Twin Towers apartment complex was registered under the name Lawrence King. When the FBI spoke with King, he said he had evicted Nelson when he heard about the incident. Officers discovered that King rented several units in the Twin Towers complex, including the penthouse, and an interview with the building manager revealed rumors that King was a heavy drug dealer with a preference for young boys. Nelson would later contend that King used his deep bankroll to make the investigation go away. Nelson would not be indicted on these charges, and he would disappear for several years before making critical contributions to the investigation in 1990. In 1988, Officer Carmian was dispatched to interview Shawnetta Moore, a 15-year-old girl whose testimony involved the same themes, players, and patterns of abuse, pointing again to a broad exploitation network within the city of Omaha. Moore was located at Richard Young Hospital, where she had told her therapist that she was the victim of nude photography and suffered at the hands of powerful men committing satanic rituals. Moore reported that she was friends with Kimberly and Nellie Webb, and that it began when all three of them were earning money by modeling for an unnamed photographer who was likely Rusty Nelson. Moore claimed that many of those photographing and purchasing photographs were leaders of the North Omaha Girls Club. She claimed she was coerced with threats of violence, and that she reported the photography network to law enforcement and the superintendent of her school, Deward Finch. Finch was mentioned in previous testimony as a friend and frequent visitor of the Webbs, and nothing came from her criminal report. Moore reported that she was gradually introduced to ritualistic parties where kids were drugged. She described graphic and indecent acts performed by men at these parties, and she identified Lawrence King by name. She claimed that many of these ritualistic parties occurred at a home owned by King on Wirt Street. The investigating officer drove to the area and saw King's name printed on the awning of the home. The officer's report indicated that Moore seemed reluctant to trust, especially when King's name was mentioned, and it wasn't until later in 1988 that she was completely forthcoming. Her disturbing testimony about satanic ritual and abuse was later collected and entered into the Franklin Committee's senatorial investigation and report. Shawnetta Moore's testimony included descriptions of the homicides of several children, and she named King as a leading participant. She attended parties that were identical to the testimonies of the Webbs. She remembered votive candles scattered around the room, men cloaked in long robes, and descriptions of the rituals as power meetings. Smith recounted that she was locked in a room with a Caucasian infant and told that she could achieve great power by killing something that she really loved. The men decapitated the infant and removed the eyes before leaving the room. Smith stayed in the room overnight and described hearing whippings and beatings in the building. She was released the next day and told to return for the next power meeting. In fear for her life, she complied, and she saw the superintendent of her school and Lawrence King in attendance. She described 5 other instances of ritualistic sacrifice, the details of which are more graphic than those already cited and included prolonged acts of dismemberment and cannibalism. Officer Carmian took these initial reports and told doctors at the Richard Young Hospital that he would return for more information. However, he never did. Carol Stitt later recounted to the Franklin Committee that caseworkers, employees, and therapists called Carmian requesting that he return because Smith was still sharing new accounts. Senator Ernie Chambers would uncover that Carmian had been transferred out of investigations. Chambers would recall, "I felt he'd been transferred because he was getting too close to something, and his superiors did not want him to continue." Some questioned Moore's credibility. She had been hospitalized and suffered severe psychological trauma, and law enforcement reported that she had a history of bizarre interactions with officers. However, the Foster Care Review Board Executive Director, Carol Stitt, believed her testimony was highly credible. The chronology and the details were concrete, and they overlapped in detail with the Webbs, all of whom implicated Lawrence King. But this was only the beginning. Carol Stitt believed that the Omaha Police Department was failing to investigate thoroughly, or had even resorted to intimidating and discrediting witnesses. They seemed determined to make these stories go away. But still, the reports continued to grow in number. In May 1988, Kirsten Hallberg, an employee at Richard Young Hospital, reported 7 additional witnesses who had similarly horrifying and disturbing accounts connecting back to Lawrence King. Accounts that would soon be made public. Whispers about financial mismanagement at the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union continued throughout the 1980s. In 1981, an anonymous letter was sent to the National Credit Union Association about misdeeds, and a limited investigation uncovered $400,000 in missing funds. In 1984, Edward Hobbs wrote a letter to the Franklin Board detailing embezzlement at the credit union. He was a former teller at the bank, and he was fired the day after sharing his letter. From 1984 to 1988, the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union escaped watchdog audits from federal organizations. King and several of his employees delayed and excused these potential audits to cover up their theft. But in 1988, the National Credit Union Association closed Franklin for unsafe and unsound practices, and a forensic financial accounting was conducted. 1 week later, they announced that millions of dollars of high-interest certificates of deposit had been hidden from federal examiners in the past. The total was $4 million in assets and liabilities and $30 million in missing funds. The total would later be raised to $39 million. On November 18, 1988, the state legislature demanded an investigation of the Franklin closure. The Franklin Committee was formed to investigate the neglect and financial mismanagement of the credit union, but the scope of their investigation would become much larger. The Franklin Committee was run by State Senator Loren Schmidt and State Senator Ernie Chambers. Both senators faced significant political headwinds, credibility concerns, and even dissension through the lifespan of the committee. But they were dedicated to the pursuit of truth and justice. On December 12, 1988, Senator Ernie Chambers received allegations of physical and sexual child abuse related to the Franklin Credit Union. The source of these allegations was never named. The senatorial committee was only beginning to uncover a malignant nightmare, the scope of which they had yet to imagine. On December 19th, Carol Stitt, Dennis Carlos, and Burrell Williams of the Foster Care Review Board recounted the allegations of abuse to the Franklin Committee. The first investigator hired was Jerry Lowe, a former Lincoln policeman, and by July 1989, he had gathered a great deal of secondhand evidence, including witness testimony and some financial records indicating the Omaha police chief had spent time with King at his Washington, D.C. residence. However, without substantial evidence, Senator Schmidt worried the case would fall apart. Senator Ernie Chambers and investigator Lowe resigned. By August, the Franklin Committee hired Gary Caradori, a former state patrolman, and with his assignment, the case took an even darker turn. Gary Caradori made public appeals for information, calling for victims to come forward. He networked with disgruntled social workers and advocates to identify potential victims who were hesitant to come forward. Despite the resistance and skepticism of law enforcement, he made connections with Omaha police officers and agents who reported on abuse. This holistic approach, combined with previous evidence, allowed Caradori to find and identify victims who were willing to go on the record. 4 victims allowed their testimony to be video and audio recorded. They were Alicia Owen, Troy Boner, Danny King, and Paul Bonacci. Caradori and his assistant Karen Ormiston interviewed 21-year-old Alicia Owen at the Women's Reformatory in York, Nebraska. Owen was reluctant to involve herself initially, but on November 7, 1989, she told Caradori that she had become involved with Lawrence King in August 1983, when she was just 14 years old. Troy Boner and another boy from Boys Town had invited her to a party at King's penthouse in the Twin Towers complex, just a few floors away from where photographer Rusty Nelson had been investigated. She identified prominent businessmen like Alan Baer and Harold Anderson, and the police chief, Robert Wadman. The following accounts are deeply disturbing. While her first party was in August, Owen attended multiple parties at the Twin Tower penthouse. They had fewer than 10 adults, with nearly twice as many minors, reportedly around the ages of 14 or 15. The same men were often in attendance. These parties were well stocked with drugs and alcohol, and the room featured a television set which played pornography. Owen remembered seeing many boys in varying states of dress. The boys would often be sitting in the laps of men. Attendees would retreat to back bedrooms, or other times the abuse would occur in the main room, in front of others. Owen described being assaulted by Police Chief Wadman on multiple occasions. During her taped recounting, she would request moments to stop and regain her composure. She claimed that Wadman is likely the father of her child. Owen confirmed what many of the other testimonies had already stated. She recounted private flights with King to Los Angeles, where she was victimized by violent men. This story would be corroborated by another witness interviewed by Caradori. When asked about satanic activity, Owen described a house in Leavenworth where a pentagram was painted on the kitchen floor. The home was filled with demonic pictures, and she mentioned a man named King's Horses who frequently attended the parties and oversaw King's dirty work. She claimed that King's Horses was deeply involved in occult ritual. Rusty Nelson and Lawrence King directed photography sessions at many of these parties, and Owen was forced to participate or receive physical beatings. She speculated that Nelson kept the negatives of these sessions to blackmail King. With the resulting testimony from his first witness, Caradori would recommend 62 individuals and documents to be subpoenaed, and he provided a list of alleged perpetrators, including Lawrence King, Police Chief Wadman, Harold Anderson, Alan Baer, Superintendent Deward Finch, Peter Citrone, and Judge Theodore Carlson. Caradori was directed by Owen to speak with Troy Boner. He visited Troy's mother, who described him as a boy with a great weight on his shoulder who was unwilling to share. On November 25th at 4 a.m., Troy called Caradori and the two spoke for an hour. Troy seemed paranoid, interrogating Caradori on his intentions and affiliation with law enforcement. When Troy began to share that he had been abused and deeply scarred by what happened, Caradori insisted that they not discuss it over the phone, and the two agreed to meet the following day. Caradori videotaped the conversation with his second witness on November 25th, 1989. Troy corroborated much of Owen's testimony, although some dates did not match. He confirmed that he had witnessed Police Chief Wadman assault Owen, and he named many of the same locations that Owen had mentioned. Troy explained that it began when he met Alan Baer in 1983. Another boy had taken him to an apartment on the second floor of the Twin Towers complex and introduced him to Baer, where he was abused and paid several $100s per meeting. Baer gave a picture of Troy to Lawrence King, and King approached him at the Max Bar, a prominent bar in the gay community. King paid Troy for similar abuses, and King moved Troy into a Travelodge Inn for 3 weeks, where the two met almost every afternoon. Troy would eventually be moved to an apartment owned by King, where he and other minors were frequently abused. In May 1985, Troy recruited another minor, Danny King, and introduced him to Baer just as he had been introduced. Troy, Danny, and Owen would frequently be flown on private charter planes or directed to take commercial flights to California, where they met with sadistic pedophiles. Troy claimed that some minors were not on return flights, and he assumed they had been sold or killed. With Troy's videotaped testimony, Senator Schmidt and Caradori were fearful about how to proceed, given that the institutions of power in Omaha were directly implicated. Danny King was employed, but in the process of being evicted when Caradori met him. Caradori and Troy picked up King from his apartment, where he gathered his things. Caradori filmed the interview with his third witness at a Residence Inn on December 5th, 1989. Danny confirmed that he met Baer through Troy's introduction in 1983. He was 13 or 14 years old at the time. The two drank schnapps, and Danny accepted abuse for a payment of $50, and this continued every week for 7 months until Danny was introduced to Lawrence King. The three would do drugs at Baer's residence, and Danny would be beaten and unpaid if he didn't perform certain acts to King's liking. The videotaped interview of Danny King ran nearly 6 hours, and in the days following, Caradori drove him through Omaha to confirm several of the named locations, including the apartment of Alan Baer. The 21 hours of testimony from Owen, Troy, and Danny corroborated multiple events, locations, and people in their separate accounts, and they were confirmed by testimony from other witnesses who refused to go on record. The footage was submitted to the Nebraska Attorney General's office and the U.S. Attorney on December 27, 1989. While this was a necessary step in escalating the accusations of corruption, child abuse, and Satanism, Caradori worried about the welfare of his witnesses, given the history of corruption. He housed his witnesses and supplied them with food and goods. He advocated that they receive physical and psychiatric care, and he worried about harassment similar to what the Webbs and Owen had already suffered. At the same time, Senator Schmidt and his attorney John DeCamp spoke with an agent at the FBI field office in Omaha to discuss law enforcement's inaction in previous investigations. They implicated prominent figures and shared that Police Chief Wadman had been named as an alleged perpetrator. The agent told Schmidt and DeCamp that he was close friends with Wadman and that the committee would receive the full and direct scrutiny of the FBI if they chose to implicate him. As a result, DeCamp turned to the press, releasing a memo that publicly named many of those mentioned in the videotaped testimony. The shockwaves of this memo reached throughout newspapers and television networks in Nebraska and neighboring states. A blurb was even written in Newsweek magazine. Omaha reporters and officials were quick to discredit DeCamp. The Lincoln Journal and World Herald only printed excerpts, stripping the names of those implicated. DeCamp and others posited that the editorial decisions were influenced by Peter Citrone and Harold Anderson. Citrone was a prominent newspaper columnist who wrote for the World Herald, and Anderson was the former publisher of the World Herald. Both were implicated in the child abuse allegations. On March 1st, 1990, the FBI debriefed Danny King, who began to recant what he told Caradori on videotape. They conducted multiple-hour debriefings, and his story remained unchanged until March 5th. He claimed to have lied about the interstate flights, but he reiterated the abuse by Baer and King. Danny King blamed Troy Boner for the fabricated stories. He claimed that Troy was looking to sue King for millions, and the orchestration of the testimony was meant to ensure their victory in the judicial system. By the end of March, Danny had recanted almost all of his testimony, including the repeated abuses of Baer and King. The FBI followed by debriefing Troy Boner, who recanted much of his testimony as well. The DeCamp memo, the leaked videotaped testimony, and the recantation of Danny and Troy greatly wounded the investigation. DeCamp, Schmidt, and Caradori believed the FBI had coerced the recantations. Caradori met with Paul Bonacci on May 10, 1990, after getting his name from a member of the Concerned Parents Organization. Bonacci was in the Lincoln Correctional Center for 2 charges of sexual assault on a child. The victims were 13 and 9 years old. Bonacci was evaluated by a court-appointed psychiatrist and diagnosed with what was formerly known as multiple personality disorder, but what is now known as dissociative identity disorder. The disorder, while controversial in diagnostics, often presents in disorganized victims who suffer repeated and severe abuse as a child. Bonacci was born in Omaha, the second youngest of 6. He came from a broken home, with a second and then third stepfather. He suffered neglect, and a predatory neighbor began abusing him at the age of 6. When he was 9 or 10, Bonacci became involved with drugs and sex work, loitering in a nearby park frequented by pedophiles. This quickly matured into parties where he encountered and embraced Satanism and large-scale exploitation. In the first 7 hours of videotaped interview, Bonacci confirmed he met Owen, Danny, and Troy in late 1983 at the Twin Towers apartments. He had already been abused by Citrone, Bear, and King. He described meeting Citrone at an amusement park, where he was solicited, and he described meeting Bear in 1979 in the Milk Run neighborhood. Bonacci was just 12 years old when he was abused by Bear and paid $20. He remembered that the encounters frequently included sadistic abuse like beatings, cuttings, and burnings. Bonacci claims that his affiliation went on to include cross-country flights to California, D.C., and Des Moines, the same locations cited by the other witnesses. In one particularly brutal recounting, Bonacci claims a camera crew followed them to a remote area outside Sacramento. One of the boys was placed in a cage, and the other two were instructed to beat and abuse him. A particularly sadistic man joined the assault before shooting one of the boys with a handgun. The other two were instructed to continue their abuse afterwards. That night, Bonacci would unsuccessfully attempt suicide in the hotel bathroom, resulting in a 2-day stay in a California hospital. Bonacci confessed that he participated in the abduction of 12-year-old Johnny Gosch in Des Moines. It was the early morning of September 6, 1982, when Gosch vanished without a trace. The only remnants of his presence were a wagon with undelivered newspapers and his dog, left to wander the street alone. The search was immediate and widespread. Flyers were plastered on every surface, and the police were inundated with tips, entrenched in a case that defied explanation. The search quickly went cold. Months turned into years, and then in 1984, Johnny Gosch was one of the first missing children portrayed on a milk carton. This was an initiative to spark interest, drive public engagement, and unearth leads that might otherwise be lost. Bonacci recounted that men had forced him to kidnap Gosch. They threatened him with a pistol and instructed him to speak with the boy on the street long enough for one of the men to grab him. These men took Bonacci, Gosch, and another boy to a home near Omaha where their abuses were filmed. It was Bonacci's testimony that began to provide reason for the trips to Washington, D.C. He implied that King used children to blackmail politicians and other power brokers. The home in the area had been outfitted with security cameras to capture the illegal sexual activity. These tapes would be sold to other players to twist votes and force political capitulation. Bonacci claims that he was interviewed by the Omaha Police Department on several occasions. He even provided documentation of aggressors, including photographic evidence. However, nothing came from these investigations. Bonacci and Owen suggested that Caradori pursue Rusty Nelson, who likely had a surplus of photographic negatives. They could secure physical evidence of their testimony. On July 9, 1990, Caradori flew a 1984 single-engine Piper Saratoga from Lincoln to Chicago with his 8-year-old son. They were going to attend the MLB All-Star Game. Caradori told his wife that he would be meeting Rusty Nelson while in Chicago. Caradori made 4 phone calls while there, speaking with Lauren Schmidt, his wife, and 2 others. In one phone call, he stated that he would be acquiring photographs and other materials that would corroborate the testimony from his remaining 2 victims. Rusty Nelson would later confirm that he met with Caradori in Chicago and provided him with photographic negatives that would be the linchpin in the Franklin case. The All-Star Game ended around 11:45 p.m., and the Caradoris departed Chicago's Midway Airport at 1:51 a.m. An hour later, the plane crashed in a cornfield in Ashton, Illinois. Debris was scattered up to 1,800 feet from the fuselage, and an investigation determined that the plane had broken up mid-flight. 2 years later, it would be speculated that Caradori may have become overtaken by fatigue. When attempting to desperately recover lost altitude, he had snapped the wings off the plane. The backpack and film camera of Caradori's son were recovered nearly undamaged, yet Caradori's briefcase was not. Those close to the case believe that if Caradori had retrieved photographs, they would have been stored inside this briefcase. The following day, FBI agents, armed with a subpoena, arrived at Caradori's office, requiring the surrender of all evidence related to the Franklin case, as well as any phone logs and financial documents related to Caradori's investigations. Senator Schmidt feared that Caradori's death was one more example of corruption and cover-up. The committee hired former CIA Director William Colby to investigate the plane crash. During his tenure with the CIA, Colby notably devoted outsized resources to Operation Phoenix, which sought to disrupt the political and social support system of the Viet Cong by infiltration, assassination, torture, and more. The program resulted in over 25,000 deaths, many of whom were civilian non-combatants. Colby later became outspoken about the CIA's practices, and he received tremendous political and social pressure to keep his secrets. Colby, familiar with the pressures of political conspiracy, warned DeCamp and Schmidt about the forces at play. Colby investigated Caradori's plane crash and could not find evidence to indicate tampering with the plane. However, it's rumored that he told 3 members of the Franklin Committee that he believed Caradori had been assassinated. Mysteriously, Colby would take a solo canoe trip near his Maryland home in 1996, and he would go missing, only to be recovered 9 days later. There were no witnesses, and the scene was not thoroughly investigated, as authorities believed it was a stroke or accidental drowning. His life jacket was missing from his shed, but it was not recovered with his belongings. The purpose of the Douglas County Grand Jury was to judicially review the Franklin-related child abuse allegations. The grand jury proceedings would be private, and they would make decisions on who to indict to stand trial as criminal defendants. The prosecutor began by calling witnesses, reviewing testimony, and sharing evidence with a jury of Nebraskan citizens. They began by reviewing the earlier allegations of the adopted Webb children, and they released an interim report that would be used to indict Jarrett Webb on third-degree sexual assault charges against his adopted daughter, Lisa. This interim report was released to ensure charges could be filed before the statute of limitations expired the possibility. The grand jury spent the majority of their time reviewing Caradori's videotaped interviews. The witnesses themselves appeared before the grand jury, and Danny and Troy upheld their recantations. Their testimony was meant to discredit Owen and Bonacci. Troy claimed that Owen had called him and fed him the information contained in his 7-hour taped interview, and Danny echoed these claims during his short time on the stand. Owen spent 2 days testifying, and she was questioned about her history of psychiatric hospitalizations, drug use, financial fraud, and more. Bonacci testified, but his history of sexual offenses and psychiatric diagnosis greatly damaged his credibility. The Douglas County Grand Jury released its final report on July 23, 1990, less than 2 weeks after Caradori's death. The subsequent publication of the World Herald read, "Grand Jury says abuse stories were a carefully crafted hoax." The report claimed that child abuse allegations related to King were nothing more than rumor. It claimed to have found no evidence of any children being transported on interstate flights, despite passenger manifests and pilot interviews missing from admitted evidence. The report concluded that Lawrence King had used money to solicit and procure men in their late teens and early 20s, which was considered adult pandering. King was not prosecuted because of the pending federal financial case that would result in his conviction. Instead, the jury indicted Alicia Owen on 8 counts of perjury, Paul Bonacci on 3 counts of perjury, and Alan Baer for 2 counts of adult pandering. In 1991, King was convicted of embezzling over $39 million from the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. The court found him guilty of making fraudulent financial transactions and misappropriating funds, which led to the credit union's insolvency and subsequent federal takeover. King was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a judgment that aimed to hold him accountable for the financial damages his actions caused. In addition to his prison sentence, King was ordered to make restitution, although the prospect of recovering the embezzled funds was considered slim due to the scale of his theft and his depleted resources. The aftermath of the Franklin Committee's investigation and grand jury trial were as multifaceted and complex as the case itself. King's conviction brought a sense of legal resolution to the financial aspect, but left many in the community still grappling with the unresolved allegations of child abuse and exploitation. Some believed that justice had been done. They believed that the allegations of child abuse had come from compromised witnesses, the testimonies of children who had suffered difficult lives by any measure, compounded by drug use, sexual abuse, and more. They believed that these children had suffered greatly, but they had ultimately been confused or coached by investigators and social workers. Satanic panic was at its peak in the 1980s and 1990s. It was a period of heightened fear about demonic ritual abuse, and it had become public hysteria. In short, they believed that the stories were too salacious and sensational to be true. Others found the testimony of the videotaped witnesses to be compelling. They pointed to historical precedents for cover-up, indicating that those in positions of power wielded undue influence to dismiss and discredit witnesses. They believed that law enforcement had been deliberately inept, and the system had not only failed to find justice, but actually contributed to the harm of the outspoken victims. In 1994, a British television company known as Yorkshire Television produced a documentary titled Conspiracy of Silence. The documentary was developed in cooperation with the Discovery Channel. It sought to publicize and explore the allegations of child abuse and exploitation surrounding the Franklin scandal. It was scheduled to air on Discovery, and the event was printed in the TV Guide for its debut time slot. At the last minute, the Discovery Channel unexpectedly pulled the documentary from the broadcast schedule shortly before its airing. While the official reason was not named, it's believed that legal and political pressures were responsible. The suppression of the documentary is one more talking point for those who believe the Franklin scandal was the result of a widespread cover-up. Additionally, there are 15 suspicious deaths connected to Franklin. Bill Baker was a restaurant owner in Omaha. Baker knew King and was a partner in his pornography operations. He was found shot in the back of the head. Sean Boner was the brother of Troy Boner. In 1991, Sean was just 20 years old when he was found with an accidental gunshot wound to the head. Investigators told reporters that Sean had fired the weapon himself. He was found slumped on the couch. Sheriff Pat Thomas claimed that it appeared Sean had been drinking and must have believed the gun was empty at the time. Aaron Owen, brother of Alicia Owen, was found hanging from a ventilator by a prison-issued bedsheet in 1990. He was serving a 4 to 7 year term for several charges, and he died in his cell just hours before one of Alicia Owen's court dates. Claire Howard was Alan Baer's former secretary. She had access to his schedule and personal information, revealing his attendance of King's parties and prior relationships with underage boys. She mysteriously died in her sleep in 1991. Several of King's former associates perished under suspicious circumstances. Dan Ryan was found suffocated in his vehicle. Charlie Rogers was shot with a shotgun, which was ruled a suicide. Joe Malek was found with a gunshot wound, which was also ruled a suicide. Curtis Tucker was thrown or jumped from the window of a Holiday Inn. Others, who were only tangentially related to the case, also had bizarre circumstances of death. Mike Lewis was a caregiver for Shawnetta Moore. He died of a severe diabetic reaction. Bill Skoleski was an Omaha police officer who had been conducting his own investigation into King, and he died of a cardiac event. Kathleen Sorensen had fostered Nellie and Kimberly Webb after they left the care of Jarrett and Barbara Webb. Sorensen died in October 1989 in a two-car collision just 2 miles east of Arlington, Nebraska. Sorensen collided with another vehicle when it crossed the center line and hit her head-on. Lastly, Harmon Tucker, who supervised vocational schools in the area, was reported missing on October 18, 1988. He was found on November 1st along a logging road 1,400 miles away from Omaha. Tucker was found by hunters with a .22 caliber gunshot wound to the head, just a few miles away from hunting grounds frequented by Harold Anderson. The circumstances surrounding these deaths forge an alarming pattern, and they underscore the chilling possibility that these were calculated acts. What truths were buried with the deaths of these individuals, and what truths were still waiting to be uncovered? In the years following the Franklin scandal, Paul Bonacci served his time for his convictions. He filed a federal suit against Lawrence King and won because King refused to appear in court. Bonacci was awarded a $1 million settlement, but it's unclear how much of this money, if any, was ever collected. In 1997, Noreen Gosch had survived a divorce and moved into an apartment on her own. It was 15 years after the disappearance of her son, Johnny Gosch, and she was trying to put the pieces of her life back together. She claims that 2 men appeared at her door in the middle of the night, and she recognized one of them as her son almost immediately, which was confirmed when he revealed an identifiable birthmark on his chest. Gosch traveled with another man who spoke very little. He didn't mention his living situation or the abuses he had suffered, but he did confirm much of Paul Bonacci's story about his abduction. They only spoke for a few hours before Gosch left, claiming that he was on the run from his abductors and he would not be safe until the perpetrators were brought to justice. Paul Bonacci is 57 years old now. He has a family of his own, and he still lives in Nebraska. He was briefly interviewed in 2023 about the aftermath of the Franklin scandal and the Gosch abduction. Bonacci confirmed Noreen's story. He claims that he has been visited by Gosch between 15 and 20 times, the last being in 2018. He stated that Gosch is afraid to come out of hiding, afraid that his name will be added to the list of suspicious deaths. As long as Gosch lives, so does a version of the truth. The aftermath of the Franklin scandal remains unresolved, a sorrowful litany of unanswered questions. Although King was convicted for embezzlement and conspiracy to defraud the United States, the deeper, more disturbing accusations of systemic sexual abuse, corruption, and ritualistic worship remain. The question of whether the truth was inherently hidden or deliberately obscured remains one of the Franklin scandal's most enduring mysteries. It is a haunting reflection about the nature of power and the potential for darkness. It's a chilling reminder that the very institutions designed to uncover the truth can sometimes seek to obscure it.